Hello, everyone. I'm glad you are here tonight. You pressed play, maybe to relax, maybe to learn something new, or maybe just to let your mind drift away into a quiet story. Before we dive in, let me ask you a question. Where are you listening from right now, and what time is it for you? I find it fascinating to imagine all the different places, all the different rooms, all the different moments that connect through this one simple story. Some of you may be listening late at night, others in the early morning, perhaps on a train ride, or maybe while lying in bed waiting for sleep to arrive. No matter where you are, thank you for joining me. Tonight, I want to talk about something often overlooked, something that rarely gets the spotlight in grand discussions of history. Everyone knows about the towering majesty of ancient Rome, the glory of Greece, the splendor of Renaissance Florence, or the cathedrals and knights of the Middle Ages. Yet, tucked away between the famous ages is one that shaped daily life more than people realize. A time that breathed slowly, quietly, without the dramatic conquests or flashy inventions that make school textbooks. And yet, without it, the world we live in would not look the same. I am speaking of what I call the forgotten hinge of history, an era that existed between the fall of great empires and the rise of new ones. The 9th and 10th centuries, a time often brushed aside as uneventful, but in reality, it was one of the most underrated eras in human history. Imagine Europe after the fall of the Roman Empire. Cities had crumbled, roads fell into disrepair, and the buzzing complexity of the ancient world slowed into a quieter rhythm. People lived in small villages, often centered around fields, rivers, or wooden fortresses. To many modern eyes, it might look simple, even dull, but when you look closer, you discover a hidden richness. Life during this period was not empty. It was filled with small rituals, with traditions passed down through generations, with the kind of ingenuity that grows when resources are limited and survival is always at the edge of thought. Food, for instance, was far more inventive than we imagine. The people of this so-called forgotten age did not eat feasts like the wealthy Romans had, nor did they enjoy the refined spices of later medieval courts, but their meals carried the deep flavor of necessity and creativity. Rye bread, thick and slightly sour, was common in the colder regions. Oats were boiled into porridge, hearty and sustaining, something you could eat in the morning before working long hours in the fields. In warmer climates, barley beer was brewed not just for enjoyment but as a safer drink than water, since boiling and fermenting reduced sickness. If you were lucky enough to live near forests, you would gather berries, mushrooms, and wild herbs, while coastal communities relied heavily on salted fish. What seems ordinary to us was, in fact, the foundation of resilience. Each meal was not just food, it was survival woven into daily ritual. Entertainment too had its place, though perhaps not as we imagine it. With no theaters, no grand arenas, people turned to storytelling. Around the fire at night, elders told tales of ancient heroes, sometimes distorted echoes of Roman or Greek myths, sometimes local legends about spirits in the woods or gods of the harvest. Music drifted from simple wooden flutes, bone whistles, or string instruments like the lyre. Dances were not choreographed performances but rather communal celebrations, often tied to the cycles of the year, harvest festivals, winter feasts, spring awakenings. When the crops were finally stored and the animals safely in their pens, whole villages would gather, drink their beer or mead, and celebrate the simple fact of making it another season. The social world, though smaller in scale than the mighty empires before it, was deeply human. Villages formed close-knit webs of obligation and trust. Everyone knew everyone, and survival depended on cooperation. If your roof collapsed in a storm, neighbors came to help repair it. If someone fell ill, herbal remedies were prepared, and prayers whispered to saints or spirits. Religion, in fact, became one of the binding threads of this period. Christianity spread steadily across Europe, yet local traditions and pagan beliefs remained alive, blending into something unique. It was not unusual to find Christian crosses carved into wooden shrines that also bore the marks of older deities, or to hear priests preaching sermons that echoed with the rhythms of earlier folklore. When we think of progress, we imagine inventions, discoveries, and conquests. But progress can also be quiet, like soil slowly enriching itself after a storm. During the 9th and 10th centuries, fields were plowed in new ways, Iron tools became more common, and small advances in agriculture allowed villages to feed more people. These subtle changes may not sound dramatic, yet they laid the groundwork for the population growth and urban revival that would later explode in the High Middle Ages. Without these innovations, without this quiet resilience, there would have been no bustling medieval towns, no Gothic cathedrals, no trade routes stretching across continents. This underrated era was like a pause between two great songs in history. It lacked the flashy crescendos of empire and the dazzling chords of the Renaissance, but in its stillness, it held something vital. It was the time when humanity caught its breath, adapted to new realities, and laid foundations that would carry forward for centuries. And as we go deeper into this story, I want you to picture it not as a distant age of shadows, but as a living world full of texture, full of human details. Think of the creak of a wooden door in a small village, the smoky smell of a hearth fire, the taste of rough bread dipped in broth, the sound of laughter during a harvest dance, the quiet rhythm of footsteps on a dirt path. This was the underrated era, the overlooked heartbeat of history, and it deserves to be remembered. When we imagine this quiet, underrated era, it is tempting to think of it only as a blur of villages scattered across fields. But each day in those small communities was shaped by rhythm, by necessity, by the steady march of the seasons. If you woke up as a farmer in the 9th or 10th century, your morning began with the light, not with a clock. Roosters crowed, the first pale streaks of dawn brushed the horizon, and you rose with the cold air clinging to your breath. Beds were simple, wooden frames stuffed with straw, sometimes covered with woolen blankets if you were fortunate. Families often shared sleeping spaces, not just for warmth but for safety. Privacy, as we think of it now, was almost non-existent. The first task was always fire, a hearth at the center of the home, its embers smoldering from the night before, needed to be coaxed back into flame. Without fire, there was no warmth, no cooking, no protection against the long chill of morning. Children might be sent to fetch water from a nearby stream or well, balancing heavy wooden buckets with aching arms, while adults prepared the morning meal. Usually, this meant porridge, oats, or barley boiled slowly, thickened with whatever was available, perhaps a bit of honey if the household kept bees, perhaps a few dried berries from last summer's gathering. Bread, when it was baked, was hard and coarse, often flavored more by smoke from the oven than by anything else. But it filled the stomach, and that was what mattered. Work began quickly after eating. Fields demanded endless attention. Men and women together tended to the soil, plowing with heavy wooden tools tipped with iron. Oxen were prized for their strength, and if a village had even one, it was shared among households because its labor could mean the difference between harvest and hunger. The earth was not easy. It clung stubbornly, full of stones, full of roots, and every season threatened either too much rain or too little. Farming was not a profession. It was survival written into every hand blister and every aching back. Children were not spared from labor. From a young age, they were expected to help, scaring crows from the crops, gathering sticks for fuel, tending goats or sheep. Education in the sense we imagine, with books and lessons, was rare and reserved for monasteries or the children of nobility. For most, learning meant watching, imitating, and slowly mastering the skills needed to keep the household alive. Yet even in the grind of necessity, life held moments of rhythm and small joys. Women spun wool into thread, their fingers working almost unconsciously while songs filled the air. Men mended tools, sharpening blades on stones worn smooth from years of use. And always, in the background, there was the awareness of nature. The smell of damp earth, the shifting winds, the call of birds. The seasons ruled over everyone, their moods harsher than any king. Summer meant labor from sunrise to sunset, a relentless push to plant, weed, and eventually harvest. Autumn carried the urgency of storage, salting fish, drying fruits, preserving what little meat there was, because winter was merciless. Winter meant dark days, bitter cold, and a kind of enforced stillness. Families huddled indoors, telling stories, repairing clothes, sharing what food they had managed to save. Spring was the time of hope, but also of danger, because reserves often ran low before new crops could grow. Many households knew the hollow ache of hunger in those months, when meals were stretched thinner and thinner. Of course, life was not only about farming. Villages needed craftsmen, blacksmiths who shaped iron into plowshares, carpenters who built wagons and tools, potters who made jars to hold grain and ale. These skills were as valuable as food itself, because without them a community could not function. Markets began to appear, not the sprawling trade hubs of later centuries, but simple gatherings where neighbors exchanged what they had in surplus. A farmer might trade eggs for a new knife, or a jug of beer for a woven basket. Money existed, but barter was often simpler, and trust within the community was the real currency. The outside world, however, was never far away. Life in this underrated era was fragile, not only because of the land but also because of threats beyond the horizon. Raids were a constant fear. In the north, the Vikings appeared suddenly on longships, their sails like red wings against the gray sky, bringing fire and terror to coastal villages. In the east, steppe raiders tested borders, swift on horseback. Even within regions, rival lords or bands of mercenaries might attack a settlement to seize food, cattle, or simply exert dominance. The walls of wooden fortresses, the watchful eyes of guards at night, all reminded people that danger was part of daily life. Religion offered both comfort and order. Churches, often made of wood in rural areas, stood at the heart of many communities. Priests guided rituals, preached sermons, and offered blessings. Festivals tied to the church calendar structured the year, giving meaning beyond survival. Yet, as I said earlier, old traditions clung stubbornly to daily life. A woman might quietly tie herbs above her door to ward off spirits even after listening to a priest denounce such practices. Farmers still whispered to the fields before planting, a faint echo of pagan rituals meant to encourage growth. This blending of belief systems gave the era a strange beauty, as though the past and future coexisted in the same moment. Amid all this, we must not forget the nobles, the small lords who controlled the land. Castles of stone had not yet spread widely. Most lived in wooden halls surrounded by palisades. Their power came from control of land and loyalty of peasants, but it was not the absolute dominance we imagine from later feudalism. Lords often lived closer to their people than later kings would, eating the same bread, fearing the same raids, though of course with more meat on their table and better furs on their backs. They demanded service, sometimes taxes in grain or labor, but they also provided a measure of protection. Their warriors trained with spears and shields ready to defend, or sometimes ready to plunder a neighbor. And so, daily life in this underrated era was a mixture of hardship, resilience, and quiet continuity. Nothing about it felt grand to those who lived it, yet every act of plowing a field, every song sung in a dimly lit hall, every story told by firelight, carried forward the human spirit. The world did not stand still, though it may have seemed slow. Step by step, innovation crept forward, and in these villages, these families, the seeds of the future were planted. It is easy to imagine this era only in terms of hardship. Fields, hunger, raids, but to think of it only as struggle would be unfair. People in the 9th and 10th centuries were not just survivors, they were also dreamers, singers, and celebrators. Even when food was scarce and labor endless, they carved out time for joy, because the human spirit does not thrive on survival alone. And in that underrated, overlooked time, the ways people celebrated life reveal as much about their world as the fields and fortresses ever could. Festivals punctuated the year like bright sparks in long stretches of gray. Many of them were tied to the agricultural calendar, because farming ruled everything. When the harvest was brought in, villages erupted in celebration. The fear of hunger lifted, if only for a season, and the people allowed themselves laughter and abundance. Ale was poured freely, bread baked in large round loaves, and if the hunters had been lucky, roasted meat was shared across the community. Music filled the air, not from orchestras or polished instruments, but from fiddles, flutes, and drums made from stretched animal skins. Villagers danced in circles, their feet stamping in rhythm on the packed earth, their voices rising in songs that had been sung for generations. Winter, though harsh, carried its own kind of festivity. The long nights invited gatherings by the fire, where stories became the lifeblood of community. Tales of ancient heroes were told again and again, not with boredom but with comfort, as though retelling kept the past alive. These stories were not only entertainment, they were a way to pass down values, to teach children courage, caution, and cunning. And even in the coldest months, there were feasts tied to the turning of the year, celebrations of midwinter, where candles and torches cut through the darkness, reminding everyone that the sun would return. Games played an important role in leisure as well. Children invented simple pastimes, tossing carved wooden pieces or playing tag in the muddy streets. Adults played dice games with carved bones, sometimes gambling with small tokens of value, bits of food, trinkets, or even favors owed. Wrestling and other tests of strength were common among young men, not only as fun but as preparation for the very real dangers of fighting. In some regions, board games traveled along trade routes, early forms of what we might now recognize as strategy games, where pieces were moved across grids or patterns carved into wood. And of course, music never left their lives. Songs were not performed on stages for silent audiences. They were woven into work, into festivals, into every corner of existence. Farmers sang as they sowed seeds, rhythm helping the long hours pass. Mothers sang lullabies to children by the hearth, their voices soft against the crackling fire. Traveling minstrels appeared in some villages, carrying not only music but also news from distant places, because songs often carried stories of battles, kings, and lands far away. These were the closest thing to newspapers, wrapped in melody, teaching people about the wider world even if they never left their valley. One of the most fascinating parts of leisure in this underrated age is how deeply it was tied to nature and the spiritual world. Festivals marked the solstices and equinoxes, the moments when the tilt of the earth shaped the rhythm of life. Even as Christianity spread, the old traditions lingered in disguise. Villagers might celebrate the feast of a saint in ways that mirrored earlier pagan rituals. Bonfires, dances, and offerings that spoke more to the cycles of the land than to the saints themselves. The church sometimes frowned upon these practices, but in truth, the blending of beliefs made religion accessible to ordinary people, giving them symbols that felt familiar and comforting. For nobles and lords, leisure looked different, though it too reflected the simplicity of the times. Hunting was both necessity and sport. It displayed power, provided meat, and reinforced hierarchy, because only those with land had the right to hunt in certain forests. Hunts were social occasions with dogs, horses, and long hours in the woods. Afterwards, feasts were held in the great halls, where storytellers and musicians entertained while lords and their households ate more richly than the peasants ever could. But even in these halls, with tapestries and flickering torches, the entertainment was not so far removed from that of the village. Songs, stories, and games were the threads binding all classes together. It is also worth noticing that laughter was a constant companion in these lives. Jokes, riddles, and playful songs filled the evenings. Humor often came from the absurdities of daily life. Animals behaving badly, whether turning unexpectedly, or the endless quirks of human behavior. Even in hardship, people laughed, because humor was as essential to survival as bread. And then there were the fairs. As small trade grew, regional fairs became moments of excitement, drawing people from miles around. These fairs were not yet the grand spectacles of later centuries, but they brought novelty. Traders selling cloth, spices, or ornaments, performers juggling or playing instruments, strangers speaking with accents that sounded exotic to local ears. For many, these fairs were their only glimpse of the wider world beyond their village, and they left lasting impressions on both adults and children. Leisure in this forgotten era was not leisure as we think of it now, something to balance against work in neat portions of a schedule. It was woven into the fabric of life, inseparable from survival, belief, and community. To eat together, to sing together, to celebrate together. These were not optional pastimes. They were lifelines that carried people through hunger, fear, and uncertainty. And as I describe these moments, I want you to imagine not grand scenes, but small ones. A family sharing a loaf of bread while snow falls outside, children laughing as they chase each other through muddy fields. A village gathered around a bonfire, faces glowing in the firelight as voices rise together in a song older than memory. These were the moments of joy in an underrated age, moments that deserve to be remembered as much as any battle or king. Though life in the 9th and 10th centuries often seems locked in tiny villages, cut off from the wider world, the truth is far more complex. Even in this underrated age, roads still stretched across valleys. Rivers carried boats from one settlement to another, and wandering traders linked communities together like beads on a hidden string. The world was quieter than in the days of empires, yes, but it was not silent. Beneath the surface of hardship, a slow web of connection was weaving itself, one that would later blossom into great trade networks and cultural exchanges. Imagine a villager standing on the edge of their small community, watching a traveler arrive. The stranger might be a peddler with a cart filled with goods, woven cloth, iron tools, beads, or salt, one of the most precious commodities of all. Salt preserved meat, kept food edible through the long winter, and was worth carrying great distances. The arrival of such a traveler was an event, because every item they brought hinted at the wider world, at places most villagers would never see. Rivers were the lifelines of trade. Boats with flat bottoms carried goods along the waterways, easier than hauling them across rough roads that were often little more than muddy tracks. Along these rivers, small trading posts and early towns began to grow, places where goods were exchanged and cultures brushed against one another. Spices were rare, but occasionally they appeared, carried through countless hands from the east. Furs, honey, and wax traveled outward from colder lands, while fine cloth and wine traveled in return. These exchanges were not constant, not the steady streams of later centuries, but they existed, pulsing quietly like the heartbeat of the AD. Travel was not simple or safe. Roads were often broken, bridges fragile, and forests thick with danger. Bandits lurked, taking advantage of lonely stretches of land, and wild animals posed their own threats. Wolves, bears, and boars roamed Europe's woodlands, making journeys perilous. To travel meant risk, and most people never went farther than a few miles from where they were born. Yet those who did travel carried stories, ideas, and objects, and slowly, village by village, the world was knit together. Monasteries played a role far greater than their stone walls might suggest. Rising from the quiet countryside, these religious communities were not only places of worship but also centers of learning, memory, and preservation. While the outside world struggled with survival, inside the scriptoria of monasteries, monks bent over parchment, copying texts by candlelight. They preserved the words of the ancients, saving knowledge from vanishing completely. Greek and Roman works, early Christian writings, local chronicles, all were painstakingly transcribed, letter by letter, in silence broken only by the scratching of quills. But monasteries were more than libraries. They were places of refuge for travelers, offering food and shelter along difficult roads. They taught farming methods, experimented with herbs, and in many cases acted as small hubs of trade. Pilgrims visited them, carrying not only prayers but also news of distant regions. Imagine a weary traveler arriving at the gates, seeking rest, and in exchange sharing tales of storms at sea, of strange customs in far-off villages, of rumors of kings and wars. These stories filtered out into surrounding communities, adding layers to the tapestry of the age. The monasteries also shaped the rhythm of time itself. Bells rang to mark hours of prayer, dividing the day into patterns of labor and devotion. For peasants, time was ruled by the sun and the seasons, but for monks, hours were counted in cycles of prayer and chant. This structure of ordered time would one day ripple outward, influencing how later societies measured and organized their days. Yet, for all the learning and faith within the monasteries, they too were vulnerable. Raids often targeted them for their wealth in books, gold, and stored food. The image of Viking ships landing near a monastery, their warriors storming the quiet halls, became etched into the memory of the age. For villagers, it was a reminder that even sacred spaces were not safe, and that survival always required vigilance. Trade routes stretched farther than most people realize. To the east, through rivers and forests, connections reached toward Byzantium and beyond. From the north, Ships carried goods across the seas. To the south, merchants brushed against the edges of Islamic caliphates, where cities thrived with knowledge and culture. Though the connections were faint compared to later centuries, they were there, like thin threads waiting to be pulled tighter. For ordinary people, the benefits of this trade were subtle but real. A woman might wear a bead that had traveled hundreds of miles. A village might feast on salt-preserved meat that came from a distant coast. A farmer might use a tool shaped by iron from another region. These objects carried with them the touch of faraway lands, even if the people themselves never left home. Travel also carried ideas. Languages blended along borders, songs borrowed verses from strangers, and beliefs adapted when people met. Pilgrims who journeyed to holy sites returned with new customs, spreading practices that slowly transformed religious life. Traders shared news of rulers and battles, reshaping how communities understood the balance of power. Even small exchanges, stories told by firelight, jokes shared on the road, wove together the fabric of culture across distances. This underrated era, so often dismissed as stagnant, was in truth a time of quiet movement. Beneath the stillness, beneath the endless cycle of farming and survival, small threads of connection stretched farther than many imagine. And though few people of the time realized it, those threads would eventually tighten into the vast networks of the medieval world, networks that carried not only goods but also the very ideas that shaped the future. So when we picture this forgotten age, let us not see only isolated villages. Let us see the rivers carrying boats, the dusty tracks where traders walked, the monasteries glowing with candlelight, and the faint hum of connection weaving through the darkness. It was not an age of silence. It was an age of whispers slowly growing louder, preparing the world for change. To understand the underrated age more fully, we must step inside the homes of its people, past the walls of monasteries and the bustle of markets, and look at the core of life itself. The family. Families were the smallest and most powerful unit of survival, the foundation upon which everything else rested. They were not simply groups of people bound by blood. They were teams, each member carrying tasks, responsibilities, and expectations that shaped identity from birth to death. At the center stood the household, often a wooden structure with 1 or 2 rooms, walls sealed with mud, roofs thatched with straw. Smoke from the hearth filled the air, blackening the rafters, for chimneys were rare and ventilation poor. In these close quarters, parents, children, and sometimes grandparents lived together, their lives overlapping constantly. Privacy was a luxury no one could imagine. The role of the father was both practical and symbolic. He was expected to provide, to protect, to guide. This did not mean he towered above his family like an untouchable ruler. Rather, his identity was tied to responsibility. He worked the fields, repaired the tools, trained the sons in the labor of survival, and represented the family in dealings with neighbors or local lords. His strength was measured not only in muscle but in reliability, in his ability to keep food on the table and danger at bay. The role of the mother was equally crucial, and in many ways even more demanding. She managed the home, not in the sense of domestic leisure but as the heart of survival. She baked bread, churned butter, spun wool, wove cloth, tended the small garden, and cared for the children. Her work was constant, her hours endless, and yet she carried it with quiet endurance. Mothers also acted as healers, relying on knowledge of herbs and remedies passed down through generations. In times of illness, they were often the first and last line of defense. And beyond all of this, they shaped the emotional world of the family, offering comfort in the face of hardship. Children were not seen as fragile beings in need of long protection. From the moment they could walk and speak, they were drawn into the rhythm of work. Boys learned the skills of their fathers, how to plow, how to sew, how to use tools, while girls absorbed the endless tasks of their mothers. Play existed, of course, but it often overlapped with work. A child chasing geese away from the grain fields was at once playing and performing an essential task. Childhood was shorter than we imagine now, but that did not mean it was joyless. Within their responsibilities, children found laughter, games, and imagination, their world filled with both labor and wonder. Elders held a special place. Grandparents, if they survived into old age, became living repositories of memory. Their stories were more than entertainment. They were the threads that tied the family to the past, offering wisdom shaped by years of endurance. In a time when books were rare and literacy rarer still, the spoken word carried the weight of history, and elders were its guardians. Marriage, too, reflected the values of survival. It was not always a matter of love, though affection could and often did grow within it. Marriages were alliances, agreements between families, arrangements that ensured land, labor, and continuity. A union might mean the joining of fields, the sharing of resources, the strengthening of bonds between neighbors. Ceremonies varied, sometimes simple gatherings with blessings, sometimes more elaborate feasts, but always they were community events, because marriage did not just unite two people, it linked two households, sometimes two entire villages. Gender roles, though defined, were not rigid in the way later centuries imagined them. Survival demanded flexibility. A man might spin wool if needed. A woman might join in the harvest or defend the household if danger pressed. There were expectations, but there was also pragmatism. When storms destroyed fields or raids struck suddenly, all hands were required, and the neat lines between male and female blurred in the urgency of necessity. Identity was shaped not by individual ambition but by belonging. To be someone in this era meant to be part of a family, part of a village, part of a faith. Reputation mattered deeply because trust was the currency of survival. If a person was known to be honest, hardworking, and loyal, they could count on the support of neighbors. If they were seen as selfish, dishonest, or lazy, they risked isolation, and isolation was almost a death sentence. The community was not forgiving of betrayal because betrayal threatened everyone. Religion also marked identity from the moment of birth. Children were baptized, marriages blessed, deaths accompanied by prayers. Saints' days marked the calendar, guiding not only worship but also the flow of family and community life. And yet, beneath the Christian framework, older layers of identity persisted. People still spoke of spirits in the woods, of ancestors watching over the living, of signs in the natural world that hinted at the future. A raven circling above a field, a sudden storm, a dream vividly remembered. These were not dismissed as chance but woven into meaning. Even names carried weight. They were chosen not only for beauty but for memory, often honoring ancestors, saints, or qualities admired by the family. A name connected a child to those who came before and to those who would remember after. It was a thread in the tapestry of identity, binding generations together. Life was fragile and death was always near. Infant mortality was high, diseases struck without warning, and injuries that seem minor today could prove fatal. But families faced these realities with resilience, mourning deeply yet continuing forward. Cemeteries near churches became places not only of grief but of memory, where families gathered to remember, to pray, to connect with those who had gone before. In this way, the family extended beyond the living, always including the unseen presence of the dead. The underrated age, so often dismissed as stagnant, was in fact a time of rich, deeply human bonds. Family was not only structure, it was survival. Identity was not built on personal glory, but on shared endurance. And in that closeness, in those small homes filled with smoke and warmth, people found meaning as profound as any king or empire could claim. That if the family was the smallest circle of identity, then the next circle radiating outward was the bond between villagers and those who ruled over them. To live in this underrated era was to be part of a network of protection and duty, one that shaped the rhythm of life as surely as the seasons did. This network, which we now often call feudal, was not yet fully developed in its classic form, but its outlines were already visible, forming a web of obligations that bound people together from the humblest peasant to the most powerful lord. Imagine a village nestled in a valley. Around it stretch fields, beyond them forests, and above it on a hill rises the wooden hall or fortified manor of the local lord. He is not a distant figure. The villagers know his face, have heard his voice, and often have seen him riding past with armed men at his side. His presence is both a reassurance and a reminder of power. He offers protection against raiders, against rival lords, against the chaos that might descend from beyond the forests. In return, he demands loyalty, labor, and a share of the harvest. The obligations of villagers were not abstract. They were concrete tasks woven into the calendar. A farmer might owe several days of labor each week on the Lord's land in addition to tending his own. At harvest time, he might be required to give a portion of his grain. At moments of crisis, he might be summoned to help defend the manor, standing alongside other peasants with crude weapons. These duties could be heavy, but they were accepted as the price of survival in a world without strong central governments. The Lord's Hall was the center of authority, a place where disputes were settled and justice, however imperfect, was dispensed. Neighbors who quarreled over land might bring their case before the Lord, who listened while elders testified and witnesses spoke. Punishments could range from fines of grain or livestock to harsher measures for serious crimes. To modern eyes, justice might appear rough, uneven, and deeply influenced by social status. Yet to the people of the time, it was a vital system that preserved order where chaos could so easily take hold. The relationship between lord and peasant was not always one of resentment. There was respect, sometimes even genuine loyalty, because protection was real. When bands of raiders swept across the land, the manor could become a refuge, its walls offering shelter. When famine threatened, a wise or generous lord might open his stores, saving lives. Of course, there were cruel lords too, men who demanded more than their people could bear, who punished harshly, who saw their peasants as nothing more than resources. Stories of both generosity and cruelty spread quickly, shaping reputations that lingered for generations. The bonds of obligation extended upward as well. A local lord might swear loyalty to a greater noble, who in turn owed service to a king. These layers of allegiance created a ladder of responsibility, each rung tied to the one above and below. Oaths were not taken lightly. They were sealed with ceremonies, with hands clasped, with words spoken before witnesses and sometimes before relics of saints. Breaking such an oath was seen not merely as dishonor but as a kind of spiritual crime, one that endangered the soul. Ceremonies of loyalty were often deeply symbolic. A vassal might kneel before his lord, placing his hands within the Lord's hands as a sign of submission and trust. The Lord, in turn, would raise him up, granting land or protection. This act was not just political theater. It was a ritual that gave visible shape to the invisible web of duty that held the society together. For villagers, the visible side of this system came during gatherings, when the Lord or his stewards collected dues. These could take many forms: grain, chickens, honey, wool, or coin if available. Some lords allowed festivals or feasts where dues were paid in a more communal spirit, while others treated the process as a stern reminder of authority. Villagers might grumble, but they also understood that without this exchange, there would be no walls to hide behind, no warriors to fight for them, no justice to appeal to. Knights began to emerge in this age, though not yet in the fully romanticized form of later centuries. These were mounted warriors, sworn to lords, trained in combat, often granted small estates in return for their service. To a villager, the sight of a knight was both awe-inspiring and intimidating. Armor gleamed in the sun, weapons were finely made, and the horse itself was a creature beyond the reach of ordinary peasants. Knights were protectors, but they were also reminders of the stark divide between those who fought and those who labored. Religious authority was woven into this system as well. The local priest often stood beside the Lord during ceremonies, blessing oaths, reminding both ruler and ruled of their spiritual duties. The church reinforced the structure of obligation, teaching that loyalty and obedience were part of divine order. Yet it also offered hope, urging lords toward mercy and peasants toward patience, promising that justice not found in this life would be found in the next. The balance between burden and protection was delicate. Too much demand could break the spirit of a village, driving people to flee into the forests or to rebel in desperation. Too little authority could invite chaos, leaving people defenseless. The underrated age was not one of unchanging stagnation. It was a constant negotiation, a living experiment in survival, with each community finding its own fragile equilibrium. Think of it like a great chain stretching across the land, each link connected to another. Families bound together into villages, villages bound to lords, lords bound to greater lords, and all bound, in theory, to a king and to God. It was not perfect, it was not fair, but it was functional. It kept life from dissolving into the chaos that lurked at the edges of the known world. And within that chain, ordinary people carved out lives of meaning, not as passive subjects but as participants in a system that demanded endurance, loyalty, and resilience. Their world was shaped not only by hardship but by bonds of duty, of trust, of obligation, that held them steady in uncertain times. Though survival demanded constant work, the rhythm of the year was punctuated with moments of rest, joy, and ritual that carried immense meaning for the people of this underrated era. Villagers were not machines grinding endlessly in the fields. They were human beings who needed celebration, laughter, and shared traditions to bind them together. These festivals and rituals were more than mere diversions. They were the heartbeat of community life, the times when the collective spirit of a village shone brightest. Imagine the end of harvest. Fields once heavy with grain now lay bare, and barns overflowed with wheat, barley, or rye, carefully stored against the coming winter. The back-breaking labor of reaping was done, and exhaustion hung over every body, yet so did relief. It was in this moment that festivals erupted, celebrations that mixed gratitude with merriment. People gathered in the village square or near the church, bringing food, drink, and music. Fires blazed, meat roasted, and barrels of ale or mead were rolled out. Music filled the air. Instruments were simple: flutes carved from wood, drums made from stretched hides, stringed lutes. But their sound was powerful, driving dances that pulled even the most weary into motion. Circles of dancers spun beneath the stars, their laughter carrying across the fields. These dances were not choreographed performances. They were communal expressions, alive with improvisation and the joy of movement. Children mimicked the steps, elders clapped along, and for a night or two, worries about lords, dues, and weather faded into the background. Food at festivals was richer than on ordinary days. Bread was baked with honey, sometimes flavored with herbs. Pies filled with meat or berries appeared, rare treats that spoke of abundance. If livestock had been slaughtered for the winter, fresh cuts were roasted and shared, filling the air with savory smoke. The ordinary fare of porridge or simple stew gave way to flavors that reminded everyone that life, even in hardship, could be sweet. Rituals of gratitude often accompanied these feasts. Priests led prayers of thanks, blessing the harvest and the hands that gathered it. Yet traces of older traditions also lingered. Villagers might leave offerings at the edges of fields or whisper thanks to unseen spirits believed to guard fertility and growth. These customs blended seamlessly, Christianity and older folk beliefs entwined in a way that felt natural to those who practiced them. For them, the sacred was not distant. It was woven into the cycle of seasons and the simple fact of survival. Seasonal festivals marked the passage of time with variety and meaning. In winter, when nights grew long and cold, communities gathered for celebrations of light and endurance. Bonfires blazed against the darkness, symbols of hope and resilience. Families exchanged small gifts, perhaps carved trinkets, woven cloth, or food, and sang songs that carried through the chill air. For children, these nights were magical, filled with stories told by the hearth, tales of saints and heroes, of miracles and wonders. Spring brought its own rituals, joyful celebrations of renewal. Villagers decorated homes with greenery, wove garlands of flowers, and danced around poles adorned with ribbons. These were not idle amusements but rituals charged with meaning, ways of welcoming fertility into fields, livestock, and human life. Young men and women often took part with special excitement, for spring festivals carried undertones of courtship. Songs were sung not only to the earth but to one another, weaving love and laughter into the season. Summer festivals often honored saints' days, with processions winding through the village, banners held high, candles flickering even in daylight. The church bell rang, summoning all to gather, and the priest carried relics or icons, blessing homes, fields, and animals. Yet after the prayers, The mood shifted to celebration. Games, contests, and dances filled the day. Wrestling matches, archery competitions, or races might be held, offering both entertainment and a chance to display skill. Winners gained not only pride but sometimes small prizes, perhaps a jug of ale, a loaf of sweet bread, or the admiration of neighbors. Communal rituals bound the village together in times of sorrow as well. When someone died, the entire community took part in mourning. The body was prepared with care, often by neighbors as much as by family, washed and clothed in simple garments. Bells tolled, drawing people to the churchyard, where prayers were offered and the dead laid to rest. Mourning did not isolate, it united. Grief was carried collectively, eased by the presence of others who shared the burden of loss. Weddings, on the other hand, were explosions of joy. Even the poorest families tried to provide feasts for such occasions, for marriage was not only a private union but a community bond. The bride might be crowned with flowers, the groom presented with symbols of his new responsibilities. Songs were sung, gifts exchanged, and blessings invoked. The community celebrated not only the couple but the continuation of life itself, the promise of children, the weaving of new threads into the fabric of the village. One of the most remarkable aspects of these communal rituals was their inclusivity. Rich and poor, young and old, men and women, all took part. Hierarchy might dominate daily life, but in the glow of festivals, the barriers softened. The Lord himself might join the dance, or his household contribute to the feast, reminding all that joy and gratitude were shared human experiences. Stories, too, were an essential part of these gatherings. Around fires or in crowded halls, storytellers, sometimes elders, sometimes wandering minstrels, spun tales that stretched back generations. These stories carried lessons, preserved history, and entertained in equal measure. They told of saints who endured trials, of knights who defended the weak, of tricksters who outwitted the proud. Children listened wide-eyed, while adults found both amusement and wisdom in the words. Storytelling was not passive. It was interactive, filled with questions, laughter, and sometimes debates over meaning. Through these festivals, rituals, and traditions, villagers reminded themselves that life was more than toil and obligation. They found joy in music, meaning in ritual, and strength in community. They reaffirmed bonds of trust and belonging, ensuring that when hardship returned, as it always did, they faced it not as isolated individuals but as a united people. In this way, the underrated age reveals its richness. Far from being gray and joyless, it pulsed with color, music, laughter, and faith. Festivals were not escapes from reality. They were essential affirmations of it, proof that even in times of burden, humanity finds ways to celebrate, to hope, and to endure. When the sun set and the fields grew dark, when work was finished and the animals had been fed, the people of this underrated age did not simply fall silent. They gathered, they spoke, they told stories. In a world without books in every household, without glowing screens to fill the night, words carried a weight and power that shaped how people understood themselves, their past, and their place in the world. Picture a family huddled around the hearth, firelight dancing against rough wooden walls. The crackle of flames accompanies the voice of an elder, steady and deliberate, as he tells a story he himself heard in his youth. Children listen wide-eyed, clutching one another when the tale grows frightening, laughing when the trickster character plays his pranks. Parents listen too, not because the stories are new but because they are familiar, cherished, and rooted deep in memory. These oral traditions were not simply entertainment. They were the library of the people, a living archive carried in memory and voice. Through them, history was preserved, not with perfect accuracy but with a rhythm and vitality that no parchment could match. A story could stretch or shrink, adapt to the audience, shift with the teller's mood, but its core remained, linking generations together across time. Some tales were simple fables teaching moral lessons. A story of a farmer who grew greedy and tried to hoard grain might end with him losing everything, a lesson about humility and balance. A tale of a disobedient child might carry a warning about wolves in the forest or spirits that lurked in shadows. These were not idle warnings. In a world where hunger and danger were real, stories gave shape to fears and clothed them in meaning. Other tales were grander, filled with heroes and battles, saints and miracles. Villagers heard of knights who fought not only for lords but for justice, of holy men who faced demons and triumphed through faith, of queens and kings who guided their realms with wisdom or, sometimes, with folly that brought ruin. These stories connected small communities to a larger world, reminding even the humblest farmer that he lived in a history much greater than himself. Legends of the land were especially powerful. Every hill, river, or ancient tree might have a tale attached to it. A rocky outcrop might be said to be the remains of a giant turned to stone. A quiet spring might be blessed by a saint who once passed through. A grove of trees might be whispered to shelter old spirits, half feared, half revered, whom no one wished to anger. Such tales gave the landscape personality, turning geography into memory. People did not live in an abstract world. They lived in a land woven with meaning, every corner carrying whispers of the past. Traveling storytellers, minstrels, bards, or simple wanderers carried tales from village to village, broadening horizons. They sang ballads of distant wars, spoke of great cities no villager had ever seen, and spun sagas of love, betrayal, and glory. Payment for their stories came in bread, ale, or a place by the fire, and for many communities their visits were treasured events. To hear of far-off kingdoms was to feel, if only for an evening, connected to the vast sweep of history beyond the fields. Religious storytelling intertwined seamlessly with these traditions. Priests told stories of saints who tamed wild beasts, who healed the sick with a touch, who braved exile or torture but held firm in faith. These stories were not abstract sermons. They were vivid, filled with drama, often bordering on the miraculous, designed to inspire as well as instruct. For villagers, saints became both distant icons and relatable figures, human enough to suffer, divine enough to triumph. At times, stories served as veiled criticism of authority. A tale of a foolish lord who taxed his people too harshly could be told under the guise of fiction, allowing laughter to cover what was also a pointed warning. Storytelling gave a voice to those who had little power, a safe way to express discontent, to imagine justice, or to hope for change. Stories also preserved practical knowledge. Instructions for farming, for treating illness with herbs, for navigating forests, all could be embedded in tale form. A story of a woman who cured a fever with willow bark, told enough times, ensured that the knowledge remained even if no written record existed. Memory and survival were intertwined, and narrative was the thread. The act of telling itself was an art. A skilled storyteller could command attention with tone, with gesture, with pauses that stretched the listener's imagination. Some spoke softly, drawing the audience closer. Others boomed with energy, filling a hall with excitement. Children might fall asleep partway through, their dreams blending with the tale, while adults nodded thoughtfully, considering its meaning. Storytelling was both performance and communion. It was not only about words but about presence, about sharing time and breath together. The power of stories extended beyond the moment. Children carried them into their own adulthood, retelling them with slight changes, shaping them anew. Villages carried shared legends as badges of identity, claiming, "This happened here, to our people on our land." Stories outlasted lifetimes, ensuring that the past was never entirely lost, even when records were destroyed or forgotten. To dismiss this era as silent or stagnant is to miss this vibrant world of words. Though most could not read or write, they lived within a culture rich with narrative. Their imaginations were not empty. They were alive with heroes, saints, spirits, and lessons woven together. In every laugh around the fire, in every shiver at a ghostly tale, in every tear shed at a story of sacrifice, the humanity of the age shines through. And so, in this underrated age, stories were not only entertainment. They were memory, identity, and hope. They carried the past into the present and offered the present a glimpse of the eternal. To listen was to belong, to tell was to live on, and to remember was to keep the community whole. life in this underrated age was never lived entirely in the visible material world. Fields, rivers, animals, and neighbors were real enough, yet around and between them stretched a landscape filled with unseen forces, both comforting and frightening. To the people of these centuries, existence was layered, and what one saw with the eye was only part of reality. Faith and superstition, belief and fear, worked together to shape how people understood their lives. The church was the anchor of this invisible order. Its spire rose above the village, its bells marked the hours, its priest guided minds and souls. For the average villager, the church was not merely a building, it was a living symbol of protection and meaning. Every week, men and women gathered there, kneeling on rough floors, listening to prayers and chants in Latin, a language most could not understand, yet whose rhythms carried a sense of mystery and power. Through the church, the great story of salvation was told again and again. Christ's suffering, Mary's purity, the trials of saints, all reminded villagers that their own suffering was not meaningless. For every hardship, there was promise. For every sacrifice, a reward awaited beyond death. This promise was not abstract but vividly imagined. Heaven as a radiant place of peace, hell as a pit of torment. To live faithfully meant aligning one's days toward eternal hope, and even if one faltered, confession and penance offered the chance to begin again. Yet faith did not stand alone. Intertwined with Christian belief were older patterns of thought, remnants of pre-Christian traditions that lingered quietly in fields and forests. A farmer might pray to God for a good harvest, yet also whisper thanks to the spirit of the field when his crops grew tall. A mother might cross herself over a sick child, then hang a charm of herbs by the bed to ward off restless spirits. These practices did not feel contradictory. To the villagers, they were simply part of a world in which the sacred and the supernatural overlapped. Superstitions filled daily life, shaping decisions in small but meaningful ways. The sight of a raven perched on a roof could spark unease. It was an omen, perhaps of death. To spill salt at the table was dangerous unless one tossed a pinch over the shoulder to confuse lurking spirits. A sudden chill might mean a ghost had passed nearby. Even children grew up learning these subtle warnings, small habits that offered a sense of control in a world where so much lay beyond human power. Amulets and charms were common. A small cross carved from wood, a pouch of herbs tied at the waist, or even a smooth stone said to have protective power. These objects carried weight because they symbolized security. Some were blessed by priests, others handed down by family, each carrying with it the trust that unseen forces could be influenced, if not mastered. The calendar of saints also infused life with invisible connections. Each saint had a domain. One protected travelers, another healed illnesses, another guarded harvests. Villagers learned which saint to call upon for each need, whispering prayers before a journey, before planting, before childbirth. These saints were not remote figures but companions in daily struggle, mediators between the harshness of earthly life and the hope of divine mercy. Night brought its own layer of belief. Darkness was not merely the absence of light but a realm where boundaries thinned. Tales abounded of restless souls wandering roads, of spirits clinging to crossroads, of witches who worked their craft under the moon. Villagers moved cautiously after sunset, carrying lanterns not only to see but to protect. A candle lit before an image of Mary, or a whispered prayer at the threshold, provided reassurance when shadows lengthened. Witchcraft, real or imagined, was a constant undercurrent. Not always the grand trials of later centuries, but small suspicions, whispers of a neighbor who could curdle milk with a glance or heal with a secret word. Fear of witches revealed both the vulnerability of communities and their search for explanation. When disease struck livestock or storms destroyed crops, it was tempting to believe some hidden malice was at work. To accuse was dangerous, for bonds of trust could unravel, yet belief in hidden powers was never far from mind. Dreams, too, were windows into the invisible. A dream of water might mean abundance, a dream of fire a warning of conflict. Villagers often shared their dreams at morning gatherings, debating their meanings. To them, Sleep was not a silent void, but a passage into realms where divine or sinister forces whispered. The blending of faith and superstition created a worldview both complex and deeply human. To modern eyes, it might seem contradictory that a villager could attend mass with devotion and still fear a ghost by the old oak tree. Yet for them, the world was not divided. All forces, visible and invisible, divine and mysterious, belonged to a single reality in which they lived, worked, and hoped. This invisible world offered comfort as much as fear. The thought that angels guarded the village or that saints watched over children gave courage when storms howled or sickness spread. The rituals of lighting candles, carrying charms, or repeating protective prayers provided a sense of agency in the face of uncertainty. And above all, the conviction that one's struggles were seen and held in a greater cosmic order gave meaning to even the hardest days. So, in the quiet of the night, when the fire dimmed and shadows deepened, villagers lived not only with their families but with the presence of the unseen. Every sound of the wind could be a whisper, every flicker of flame a sign. Their world was alive in ways both visible and invisible, filled with faith, superstition, and the enduring search for protection and hope. Sickness was never far from daily life in this underrated era, and for villagers who toiled in fields, lived among animals, and endured harsh winters, health was a fragile blessing. Illness could strike suddenly, sweeping through families, or linger slowly, draining strength over weeks. Without the science we rely on today, people turned to a blend of practical remedies, folk wisdom, and spiritual faith, each forming part of a fragile web of care. The understanding of sickness began with the body itself, yet their explanation of how it worked differed from our modern perspective. Many believed in the theory of humors, an idea passed down from ancient physicians. The body contained 4 fluids: blood, phlegm, black bile, and yellow bile, and health depended on keeping them in balance. Too much of one humor brought illness. A fever might mean an excess of yellow bile, a melancholy mood an excess of black bile. To restore balance, healers prescribed methods such as bloodletting, purging, or diets intended to cool, warm, dry, or moisten the body according to need. But humors were only part of the picture. Many illnesses were explained as the work of invisible forces, spirits, demons, or the consequence of sin. A sudden seizure might be seen as possession, a wasting sickness as punishment or a curse. For this reason, healing was never just physical. It was also spiritual. A priest might be called to bless the sick, to sprinkle holy water, or to lead prayers over a bed. Healing, in their eyes, required restoring the soul as much as the flesh. Herbs played a central role in everyday medicine. Knowledge of which plants helped which conditions was passed down through generations, guarded carefully by women and men who served as healers in their communities. Willow bark, chewed to ease pain, was a common remedy, though no one yet knew it contained the substance we now call aspirin. Garlic was valued for its power against infection and evil alike, carried as much for protection as for healing. Chamomile soothed fevers and aided sleep. Mint settled the stomach. Sage was praised for cleansing wounds and strengthening memory. These herbs were often prepared in teas, poultices, or tinctures, combined with prayers or charms to increase their power. To the healer, the plant was not simply a physical remedy but part of a larger harmony between nature, body, and spirit. Gathering herbs itself was an act surrounded by ritual. Some picked plants only at dawn, others whispered blessings as they harvested, believing that respect ensured potency. Midwives were among the most respected healers in villages. They guided women through childbirth, a moment of both hope and danger, for maternal and infant mortality were common. A midwife's knowledge of positioning, breathing, herbal aids, and calming rituals made her indispensable. Yet their closeness to life's mysteries also brought suspicion. Midwives, like herbalists, sometimes walked a fine line between being revered for their skill and feared for their unusual knowledge. When epidemics swept through, fear magnified. Diseases like smallpox, dysentery, or plague could decimate entire communities. With little understanding of contagion, people often explained such outbreaks as divine punishment or the work of malevolent forces. Villages might hold processions, carrying crosses through the streets, ringing bells to drive away evil, or fasting together in hopes of mercy. Some burned herbs to cleanse the air, a practice that, though symbolic, may have helped in small ways by deterring pests. The role of monasteries was also vital. Monks studied ancient texts, copied medical treatises, and cultivated herb gardens that provided remedies for local communities. Within monastery walls, the sick could sometimes find structured care: a bed, clean water, and food, along with prayers and treatments. Though limited by the knowledge of the time, monasteries represented some of the earliest hospitals in Europe, where compassion and healing were blended. Surgery, crude by our standards, was occasionally practiced. Barbers often doubled as surgeons, performing tasks such as pulling teeth, lancing boils, or setting broken bones. With no anesthetics beyond alcohol or herbs, patients endured pain with courage or prayer. Cauterization, using heated metal to seal wounds, was brutal but sometimes effective against infection. While survival rates varied, the very attempt to heal reflected resilience and determination. Not all remedies worked. Some were born from misunderstanding, like applying dung to wounds or using charms against fevers. Others worked by chance or through the placebo effect, where belief itself aided recovery. Yet behind every attempt lay the same impulse we recognize today: the desire to relieve suffering, to preserve life, to care for one another. Illness carried not only physical weight but social meaning. A sick person might be isolated out of fear or cared for with devotion by family members. Communities came together in times of crisis, sharing food with stricken households, or digging graves when death could no longer be prevented. The presence of illness reminded everyone of their vulnerability, yet also of their interdependence. In this underrated age, healing was not a separate science practiced in sterile halls. It was part of the rhythm of life, woven into farming, family, and faith. A mother soothing a fevered child with an herbal infusion, a priest murmuring prayers over a sickbed, a midwife guiding a birth by candlelight. All were healers, all participants in the ongoing struggle against frailty. To modernize, some practices may seem misguided, but they reflect a deep truth. In every era, people use the tools and knowledge they have, shaped by their culture and belief, to face the uncertainties of health. Their efforts, though imperfect, testify to a universal human drive, to comfort, to cure, and to hope. So, in this world where sickness lurked in every season, healing was not only about herbs or humors. It was about courage, about faith, about the strength of communities that refused to surrender to despair. It was about facing fragility with persistence, and in doing so, revealing a resilience that remains inspiring even centuries later. In the underrated age, childhood was a world all its own, shaped by both freedom and responsibility, by imagination and necessity. Unlike the modern idea of prolonged leisure and schooling, children in villages experienced a life of gradual immersion into adult duties, yet one rich with play, storytelling, and the simple joys of discovery. Their days were long, their lessons practical, and their games often echoed the adult world they would soon inherit. From the earliest age, children were integrated into family labor. Toddlers learned by imitation, following older siblings or parents as they tended animals, gathered firewood, or helped in the garden. A small child might carry water, feed chickens, or fetch herbs, participating in tasks that taught not only skills but responsibility. Mistakes were met with guidance rather than indulgence. A spilled pail of milk or a broken tool became a lesson in care, patience, and persistence. Through such small tasks, children acquired an understanding of their place in the household and the rhythms of survival. Yet life was not all work. Imagination filled the spaces between chores. Children crafted toys from whatever materials were at hand. Sticks became swords or horses, clay molded into tiny animals, scraps of cloth sewn into dolls. Games often mirrored adult roles, with pretend trading, mock battles, or reenactments of festivals and ceremonies. In this way, play was education, teaching strategy, social skills, and cultural norms, while also offering release and delight. Community gatherings amplified the joys of childhood. Festivals and seasonal celebrations allowed children to participate fully, dancing in circles, racing through the village square, or singing songs that echoed across generations. Storytelling by the hearth enchanted them, bringing to life heroes, spirits, and tricksters, instilling a sense of wonder that shaped moral understanding and creativity. Religious instruction played a significant role as well. Even without literacy, children absorbed prayers, hymns, and moral lessons. The rhythms of the liturgical calendar marked the passage of the year and festivals. Saints' days and church rituals introduced children to a broader sense of morality, duty, and belonging. Church was also a venue for learning social structure and observation, teaching the interplay between authority, community, and spiritual life. Childhood, however, was also shadowed by the awareness of mortality. Disease, accidents, and scarcity meant that not all children survived into adulthood. Those who did often grew up with an acute sense of the precariousness of life, which shaped their resilience and adaptability. Stories of saints and heroes were not abstract tales but models of courage, patience, and endurance, offering guidance in the face of misfortune. Friendship and peer relationships were critical. Children of the village formed bonds that would often last a lifetime. They taught each other tricks, shared secrets, and collaborated in games or chores. Older children mentored younger ones, passing down traditions and techniques, just as elders passed wisdom to their families. This web of mentorship ensured continuity and strengthened the social fabric of the village. Education in survival extended beyond the family. Villagers instructed children in navigating the surrounding landscape, forests, rivers, and hills, recognizing edible plants, tracking animals, and finding safe shelter. These lessons, often transmitted through demonstration or storytelling, were vital for preparing young people for the unpredictable challenges of the outside world. Mistakes could be instructive, sometimes frightening, yet each one honed awareness and skill. The transition from childhood to adolescence was gradual, marked not by formal ceremonies but by growing responsibility. Tasks increased in complexity, expectations expanded. A boy might begin taking livestock to distant pastures alone, learning both independence and accountability. A girl might manage a household garden, care for younger siblings, or assist in baking and preserving food for the winter. Each milestone reinforced the connection between competence and identity, between individual effort and communal survival. Even as responsibilities grew, moments of joy and mischief persisted. Adolescents raced through fields, climbed trees, or played mock battles that honed reflexes and courage. They whispered secrets, shared small rebellions, and experimented with the first inklings of romantic interest, all while learning the boundaries set by family, neighbors, and tradition. These experiences were essential, blending play with preparation, imagination with practicality. The underrated era's childhood was not leisurely, but it was formative, layered, and vibrant. It combined labor, play, learning, and socialization into a holistic experience. Children were never isolated. They were embedded within families, villages, and rituals, growing up immersed in a living, breathing world. Every task, every game, every story was a thread in the tapestry of life, preparing them for the challenges and joys of adulthood. Through this lens, childhood emerges as a period of careful cultivation, not of enforced innocence, but of practical wisdom, social acumen, and imaginative capacity. In learning the land, the people, and the unseen forces that shaped their lives, children became adept navigators of the world, equipped to inherit the intricate networks of responsibility, faith, and community that define this underrated age. As children grew into adolescence in this underrated era, their world expanded, revealing new responsibilities, new challenges, and new possibilities. The transition was subtle yet profound, guided by both necessity and culture. Adolescence was not merely a biological phase. It was a socially constructed period, a bridge between the safety of childhood and the responsibilities of adulthood, where the seeds of social identity, skill, and personal reputation were sown. During these years, labor intensified. Boys and girls were expected to contribute meaningfully to household and community tasks. A young man might learn the techniques of plowing, fence building, or blacksmithing with far more independence than before. He was entrusted with greater responsibilities, sometimes managing livestock on his own or assisting with heavier fieldwork. Through these tasks, he learned patience, endurance, and the physical limits of his body, as well as the careful observation required to maintain animals and crops in a world where mistakes could mean famine. Girls, meanwhile, took on greater roles in the household economy. Beyond basic chores, they learned to manage cooking over open hearths, to preserve fruits and vegetables, to brew small amounts of ale or mead, and to weave cloth or mend clothing. The skills they acquired were critical, for a village depended on each household's ability to sustain itself through the seasons. Adolescence for girls involved mastering not only technique but timing, efficiency, and the subtle art of planning ahead to ensure survival through winter. Rites of passage, though informal compared to later societies, marked these years. Certain tasks or challenges signified competence and readiness for adult life. A boy might be judged by his skill in archery, in navigating forests, or in handling animals. Successfully delivering a herd to distant pastures or constructing a small structure could earn respect from elders. For girls, managing a large portion of household duties or demonstrating skill in preparing food, herbs, or textiles was a public acknowledgement of maturity. These accomplishments were not mere tasks. They were symbolic affirmations of readiness to take on adult roles and responsibilities. Social dynamics also shifted. Peer relationships became more complex, and the hierarchy of the village extended into adolescence. Older adolescents often supervised younger ones, creating a layered system of mentorship and influence. Friendships were tested through both cooperation and competition, whether in chores, games, or informal contests. Rivalries developed, sometimes spilling into mock duels or competitive tasks, all of which honed skills, reflexes, and resilience. Respect and reputation were crucial. Adolescents quickly learned that how they conducted themselves influenced not only immediate social standing but long-term acceptance within the community. Courtship emerged gradually in these years. Young people observed and participated in the rituals of attraction, often under the watchful eye of family. Festivals and communal gatherings became opportunities to display skill, humor, and charm. Dancing, singing, or demonstrating strength or cleverness could attract attention, while small tokens or gestures hinted at affection. These early encounters taught subtle social negotiation, the art of expressing interest without overstepping communal norms, and the delicate balance between personal desire and social expectation. Education continued informally but with new intensity. Adolescents absorbed stories, songs, and local history, building a mental library of legends, practical knowledge, and moral guidance. They learned navigation of forests, identification of herbs, and understanding of seasonal cycles at a sophisticated level. Mentorship from elders and participation in work and ritual offered a combined curriculum of survival, ethics, and social skills. Unlike formal schooling, this education was deeply embedded in lived experience, blending knowledge and practice seamlessly. Spiritual life remained central during adolescence. Young people were expected to participate more fully in religious observances, to understand the meanings behind prayers, blessings, and seasonal rituals. Confession and participation in church activities reinforced moral and ethical frameworks. At the same time, the intersection of superstition and faith persisted. Adolescents tested boundaries, listening to tales of spirits and witches, observing omens, and occasionally challenging adults' interpretations, learning to negotiate belief with curiosity. Adolescence was also a time of experimentation and risk. The desire for independence and autonomy prompted young people to explore the village's limits, forests, and fields, testing both courage and skill. Some ventures were playful, races through the woods, climbing trees, or secret meetings with friends, while others carried real danger, such as handling animals, managing fires, or venturing near rivers. These experiences built resilience, judgment, and a nuanced understanding of risk, all crucial for adult life in a world shaped by uncertainty. Health and bodily awareness took on new significance. Adolescents became more conscious of strength, endurance, and vulnerability. Training for tasks, games, or even survival skills highlighted both limits and potential. Hygiene, rudimentary as it was, and awareness of diet and physical well-being became part of daily knowledge. Adolescents learned that their actions, careful tending of animals, respect for seasonal cycles, attention to nutrition, had direct consequences for health and performance. By the end of adolescence, individuals had achieved a balance between personal capability and social integration. They were capable of sustaining themselves, contributing meaningfully to the village, understanding the rhythms of labor and celebration, navigating social hierarchies, and interpreting the unseen forces that shaped daily life. They were prepared to enter marriage, manage households, or take on specialized trades, carrying the accumulated wisdom of generations into the next phase of life. In this way, adolescence in the underrated era was a rigorous, multi-layered education, blending physical labor, social negotiation, moral instruction, practical skill, and imaginative engagement. It was a period that forged resilience, competence, and social intelligence, ensuring that when the time came to assume adult responsibilities, each young person carried with them not only knowledge but confidence, rootedness, and identity. Adolescence was a crucible, shaping not only bodies and skills but character, reputation, and understanding of the world's complex rhythms. In every challenge faced, every task mastered, every festival danced through, young people emerged as fully integrated members of their communities, ready to continue the traditions, stories, and labors of this underrated age. Beyond fields and hearths, beyond villages and simple dwellings, the underrated era thrived on skill and creativity, embodied in the work of artisans and craftsmen. These were the people whose hands shaped wood, metal, cloth, and clay into objects that sustained life, conveyed beauty, and reflected culture. Their work was not merely functional. It carried meaning, pride, and a form of silent storytelling, connecting labor to identity and community. Imagine a small forge in a village, smoke curling from its chimney, sparks flying from an anvil with each hammer strike. The blacksmith, young or old, strikes with precision, shaping horseshoes, plowshares, nails, and tools. Each movement is honed through years of practice, muscle memory, and observation. The clang of metal is music to the ears of those who depend on these objects. It signals progress, productivity, and security. Horseshoes ensure animals travel safely. Nails hold homes together. Tools enable farmers to tend their fields. In this way, artisans became indispensable, weaving functionality with reliability. Carpenters similarly shaped the environment. They raised beams for houses, constructed carts and wagons, and crafted furniture that transformed crude spaces into livable homes. Their knowledge extended beyond geometry and balance. They understood the character of wood, its strengths, weaknesses, and the best ways to carve it without waste. They passed these skills to apprentices, sometimes children of the family, sometimes outsiders, ensuring continuity. Their work created the very skeletons of communities, both literally and symbolically. Potters and clay workers contributed daily utility and subtle artistry. Simple bowls, jars, and storage vessels were essential for food preparation, preservation, and transport. At the same time, their shapes, designs, and decorations reflected culture, identity, and creativity. Even the simplest incised lines carried meaning, whether to indicate ownership, to distinguish content, or to invoke protective symbols. A well-crafted vessel could last decades, becoming part of multiple generations' daily lives, linking memory and labor. Textile work, largely undertaken by women, was central to both survival and social life. Spinning, weaving, and sewing were not only practical but meditative, a rhythm of hand and mind intertwined. Wool and flax were spun into threads, threads into cloth, cloth into garments that protected against harsh weather, while also conveying status, taste, and tradition. Clothing was rarely disposable. Every stitch mattered, and patterns often carried symbolic meaning, revealing origin, family, or local identity. Children learned by observing, assisting, and eventually taking over portions of the labor, preserving these crucial skills for the future. Leatherworkers transformed raw hides into durable shoes, belts, saddles, and armor. The process demanded patience, knowledge of tanning, cutting, and stitching. A well-made pair of boots could protect feet for miles of walking. A well-fitted belt could support tools or pouches. A carefully stitched armor piece could mean survival in battle. In every cut, stitch, and polishing, the leatherworker embedded utility, craft, and subtle artistry into everyday life. Glassmakers, though less common, added another dimension. Their delicate craft produced bottles, windows, and small decorative items that combined function with elegance. Even a simple glass container was a marvel of chemistry and patience, and owning one could signify both wealth and refined taste. The flicker of candlelight through a colored window, casting patterns on the walls, brought quiet beauty to otherwise utilitarian spaces. The work of artisans also intersected with faith and ritual. Churches, shrines, and communal halls required construction and decoration. Wood carvings depicted saints, gargoyles warned of evil, stained glass illustrated sacred narratives. Every stroke of a chisel or brush contributed to a world in which art, utility, and spirituality were inseparable. Artisans were not merely laborers. They were creators of meaning, translating both daily life and spiritual ideals into tangible form. Markets provided venues for these crafts to reach beyond the home. Villagers and travelers exchanged goods, bartered services, and shared knowledge. Here, artisans displayed skill and ingenuity, negotiating value, reputation, and trust. Markets were alive with color, sound, and scent. The clatter of wooden wheels, the aroma of herbs and baked bread, the jingle of coins, the hum of conversation. The presence of skilled hands transformed ordinary materials into objects that shaped experience, comfort, and identity. The apprentice system ensured continuity. Young people trained under master craftsmen, learning not just technique but judgment, patience, and the ethics of labor. Mistakes were corrected with guidance rather than harsh punishment, and successes were celebrated, reinforcing both skill and social bonds. This system fostered a cycle of knowledge transfer that allowed communities to thrive despite limited resources, preserving cultural and practical wisdom for generations. Even entertainment had a craft component. Instrument makers carved flutes, lutes, and drums. Woodworkers built game boards and toys. Painters added decoration to everyday objects. Artisans shaped not only survival but also leisure, imagination, and joy, reminding the community that life was not merely about toil, but about beauty and expression. In this underrated era, the hands of skilled workers defined both daily existence and the intangible fabric of culture. They connected survival, beauty, and identity in ways that endured for generations. Their work was a quiet but potent reminder that civilization is built not only by leaders and armies, but by the patient, meticulous, creative labor of those who shape the world with skill, knowledge, and heart. Through these craftsmen and artisans, the rhythms of village and town life became tangible, enduring, and meaningful. Every tool, every garment, every carved image was a testament to human ingenuity and resilience, a silent chronicle of the era's richness that modern observers might overlook but which shaped the very pulse of daily life. Life in this underrated era was shaped not only by labor and survival, but also by moments of leisure and celebration, which allowed communities to express joy, creativity, and identity. Entertainment was interwoven with daily routines and seasonal rhythms, providing respite from toil and a means of reinforcing social bonds. Despite the absence of modern conveniences, people found ways to amuse themselves, share stories, and mark important events with vivid pageantry. One of the most vibrant aspects of leisure was music. Villagers crafted simple instruments from wood, strings, and animal skins, producing flutes, lutes, drums, and harps. The sounds accompanied work, festivals, and domestic gatherings, sometimes lively and boisterous, other times slow and meditative. Even children learned basic tunes, clapping, singing, and dancing in rhythm, their laughter blending with the music to fill homes and courtyards with vitality. Music was functional as well as joyful, It marked time, coordinated labor, and communicated emotion in a world where oral tradition and rhythm were essential to daily life. Dance followed closely behind music. Dance was more than performance. It was an expression of identity, community cohesion, and celebration. Festivals, weddings, and seasonal gatherings were punctuated by circle dances, line dances, and improvisational displays where skill, coordination, and social grace were on full display. Participation was expected, and observers learned the steps by watching and imitating, creating continuity between generations. The body, like the voice, became a medium through which culture and memory were passed. Storytelling was central to entertainment. Villagers gathered around hearths or under trees to hear tales of heroes, tricksters, spirits, and distant lands. These stories were immersive, blending moral lessons with adventure, humor, and suspense. They were shared orally, shaped by the storyteller's voice, gestures, and timing. For children, they sparked imagination and moral reasoning. For adults, they reinforced communal values, history, and shared understanding of the world. Stories also contained practical wisdom, disguised as myth, how to navigate forests safely, how to respond to strangers, or which plants held healing power. Games and competitions offered both amusement and social training. Children and adolescents engaged in races, mock battles, and strategic games that mimicked adult responsibilities. Adults also competed in contests of skill, archery, wrestling, running, or strength challenges. Victory was less about prizes and more about honor, recognition, and status within the community. These activities fostered resilience, strategic thinking, and camaraderie, all while providing an outlet for energy and a temporary reprieve from daily labor. Seasonal festivals punctuated the year, bringing entire communities together. Winter solstice, spring planting, harvest time, and saint days provided opportunities for collective celebration. Feasts were prepared with foods that reflected both abundance and ritual significance. Roasted meats, stews rich with root vegetables, bread baked over open flames, and preserved fruits and nuts. Ale and mead flowed, often produced locally, while communal singing and dancing amplified the sense of connection. Festivals also included symbolic acts, such as lighting fires to chase away darkness, carrying effigies, or holding parades, blending entertainment with spiritual and social meaning. Storytelling, music, and dance were often intertwined. During festivals, a performer might narrate a heroic tale while playing a lute, punctuated by communal singing or dance. Audiences actively participated, clapping, stamping feet, or responding with calls and chants. This interactive engagement made entertainment communal rather than passive, ensuring that everyone, young and old, contributed to the vibrancy of the event. Even domestic life included moments of leisure. Women might spin or weave while singing softly. Children played with toys made from wood, clay, or fabric, and men occasionally passed time with simple games of chance or storytelling contests. These moments, though small, provided relief from labor, strengthened family bonds, and allowed individuals to express creativity within the constraints of daily life. Religious holidays combined devotion with festivity. Pilgrimages, processions, and church feasts offered structured joy, where music, dance, and communal meals reinforced both faith and social cohesion. The boundary between sacred and secular entertainment was fluid. Ritual, celebration, and amusement blended seamlessly, creating a rhythm that sustained both spirit and society. Travelers and performers introduced additional forms of entertainment. Minstrels, jugglers, and storytellers brought tales and tricks from distant villages and towns. Their presence enriched the local culture, offering novelty, inspiration, and a glimpse of life beyond the immediate environment. Such visits reinforced curiosity, creativity, and the desire to learn from others, expanding the imaginative landscape of even the most isolated communities. In this underrated era, joy was not a luxury but an essential counterbalance to hardship. Entertainment, festivals, and play provided structure, cultural continuity, and emotional sustenance. Music, dance, games, storytelling, and communal feasting were more than amusement. They were expressions of identity, resilience, and social cohesion. In every laugh, song, and step, communities reinforced their connection to one another and to the rhythms of life, ensuring that even in times of struggle, moments of beauty and delight endured. Through music, stories, and celebration, villagers created a rich tapestry of human experience, one that modern observers might overlook, yet which defined the texture of everyday life. These moments of joy reveal an era that, though underrated, was vibrant, imaginative, and profoundly human. Food in this underrated era was more than sustenance. It was a reflection of environment, culture, and ingenuity. The diets of villagers and townsfolk were shaped by season, geography, and social standing, yet even the simplest meals carried meaning, ritual, and occasionally delight. Cooking was both a necessity and an art, requiring knowledge of ingredients, timing, and technique, often passed down through generations. The daily diet of the majority was humble but practical. Bread was central, often baked from rye, barley, or wheat, depending on local crops. A simple loaf could be eaten with butter, cheese, or pottage, a thick, hearty stew of grains, vegetables, and occasionally meat. Pottages were versatile. Cooks added herbs to enhance flavor, and whatever protein was available, whether salted pork, beans, or eggs. Vegetables were mostly seasonal. Cabbages, turnips, onions, and root vegetables formed the backbone of meals during colder months, while in spring and summer, greens, peas, and fruits supplemented the table. Preservation was essential, as communities could not rely on constant fresh supplies. Salting, smoking, drying, and fermenting were common methods. Fish and meat were cured or smoked to last through winter, while fruits were dried or turned into preserves. Pickling vegetables not only extended their shelf life, but also added new flavors, reflecting an early understanding of fermentation as both practical and culinary. For those who could afford it, meals occasionally included more elaborate ingredients. Spices like pepper, cinnamon, or saffron, often imported at high cost, were used sparingly to flavor stews, breads, and pastries. Honey sweetened desserts or drinks, while rare, offered luxury, and nuts and dried fruits appeared in festive breads or cakes. Meals could thus reflect both survival and social aspiration, balancing necessity with indulgence. Cooking methods varied according to available technology. Open hearths were standard, and cooks used cauldrons, iron pots, and clay ovens to prepare meals. Stews simmered over embers, roasting involved slow turning over fire, and baking required careful attention to heat distribution. Even simple meals demanded skill. Too little fire and food remained raw, too much and it burned. Skilled cooks learned the subtleties of smoke, flame, and vessel, shaping flavors and textures through practice and intuition. Drinks were similarly important. Water, though available, was often supplemented with ale or weak beer, which was safer due to boiling and fermentation. Ale was consumed daily, providing calories and hydration, while wine, when available, was often reserved for special occasions. Herbal infusions were common, both for taste and medicinal purposes. Mint, chamomile, sage, or elderflower steeped into teas that comforted, soothed, or energized the body. Meals were social experiences, reinforcing family and community bonds. Communal eating brought together households, neighbors, and friends. Even simple shared bread or stew created a sense of cohesion. During festivals, food became extravagant. Roasted meats, spiced breads, sweet pastries, and preserved fruits adorned tables, accompanied by laughter, music, and storytelling. The act of preparing, sharing, and eating food reinforced hierarchy, tradition, and cooperation, embedding culinary practice into the social fabric. Children learned about food from observation and participation. They gathered herbs, helped churn butter, or assisted in feeding livestock, gradually understanding how ingredients became sustenance. Play often intersected with learning. Games involved guessing herbs, baking simple breads, or imitating adult cooking rituals. Through these experiences, children developed practical knowledge, dexterity, and respect for both labor and nutrition. Culinary creativity extended even into scarcity. Villagers improvised with what was available, combining grains, legumes, roots, and seasonal greens into nourishing meals. Foraging supplemented cultivated crops, bringing berries, mushrooms, and wild herbs into the diet. This resourcefulness ensured survival and highlighted human adaptability, turning limitations into opportunity. Ritual and food were intertwined. Religious observances, seasonal festivals, and life events were often marked by specific dishes. Harvest celebrations involved special breads or cakes, weddings included lavish feasts, and fast days required simple meals designed to satisfy without indulgence. Food became a vehicle for cultural memory, symbolism, and identity, linking sustenance to spirituality, community, and heritage. The underrated era's culinary landscape was thus rich in nuance. Every meal, whether a simple pottage or a festive roast, reflected knowledge, skill, and cultural values. Cooking was not merely functional. It was a medium of education, a channel for creativity, and a thread connecting generations. Flavor, texture, and nutrition were balanced with ritual, seasonality, and practicality, revealing a sophisticated understanding of sustenance long before modern science. Food shaped life as much as labor, craft, or festival. It dictated daily routines, influenced social hierarchies, and reflected environmental realities. Through diet, communities demonstrated adaptability, cultural depth, and ingenuity, ensuring that survival was coupled with nourishment, enjoyment, and shared experience. In this underrated era, clothing was far more than mere protection against the elements. It was a reflection of identity, status, and practicality, intricately woven into daily life. Every garment, stitch, and fabric choice carried meaning, shaping perception and signaling belonging within family, community, and the wider social landscape. Unlike the mass-produced fashion of today, clothing was crafted with care, patience, and an acute awareness of both necessity and expression. For most villagers, everyday attire was simple yet functional. Linen and wool were the primary fabrics, chosen for durability and warmth. Men typically wore tunics paired with trousers or leggings, sometimes layered with cloaks or mantles during colder seasons. Women donned long dresses or skirts with fitted bodices, often accompanied by aprons for domestic work. Both genders used belts or sashes to secure garments and to carry tools or small personal items, integrating function seamlessly into appearance. Footwear, while utilitarian, revealed skill and resourcefulness. Leather boots or shoes protected feet from rough terrain, mud, and snow. Wealthier individuals might have finer stitching or ornamentation, but for common folk, durability outweighed decoration. Some families made shoes themselves, tanning leather, cutting patterns, and stitching pieces with knowledge passed down through generations. The process was labor-intensive, yet essential, linking craftsmanship to survival. Textiles also conveyed seasonal awareness. Heavier wools and layered clothing dominated winter, while lighter linens and simpler garments prevailed in warmer months. Dyeing, though limited by available resources, added subtle color, with plant-based pigments producing shades of yellow, red, green, and blue. Patterns and decorations, even modest, could indicate regional identity, family affiliation, or social role. A simple trim on a sleeve or embroidered motif on a collar held meaning, signaling belonging and distinction without ostentation. Clothing reflected occupation. Artisans, farmers, and laborers wore garments suited to physical work, reinforced for durability and ease of movement. A blacksmith's leather apron shielded against sparks. A miller's heavy boots resisted water. A weaver's fitted sleeves allowed nimble manipulation of threads. Trades dictated not only function but also etiquette. A properly worn garment demonstrated skill, competence, and respect for one's craft. Social hierarchy influenced fashion subtly but persistently. Nobility and wealthier townspeople could access finer fabrics, imported silks, and intricate embroidery. These garments were often layered, dyed in colors that required skill or rare materials, and adorned with decorative touches signaling status. Even in a largely practical society, clothing became a visual language communicating wealth, influence, and social connections at a glance. Children's clothing mirrored adult styles but was adapted for growth, play, and learning. Tunics for boys and simple dresses for girls allowed freedom of movement for work, play, and household participation. Practicality was paramount, but even small children's garments might include decorative stitching, badges, or symbols conveying family identity. Through clothing, children were introduced to the visual codes and expectations of social life from an early age. Headwear and accessories also carried meaning. Hats, hoods, and veils offered protection, modesty, and status indication. Belts, pouches, and simple jewelry were functional yet symbolic, sometimes indicating marital status, wealth, or community role. Even small details, a clasp, a brooch, or a stitched pattern, could convey identity and intention, transforming clothing into a nuanced form of communication. Clothing was closely tied to seasonal rituals and festivals. Special garments were reserved for religious ceremonies, weddings, and community celebrations. Richer embroidery, brighter dyes, or symbolic motifs highlighted the occasion, transforming daily attire into ceremonial expression. These garments were often treasured, maintained carefully, and passed down through generations, carrying memory, history, and pride. The process of making clothing was labor-intensive and collaborative. Spinning fibers, weaving threads, dyeing fabrics, cutting patterns, and sewing garments involved multiple stages, often divided by gender and skill. Knowledge was transmitted through apprenticeship, family training, and observation, ensuring continuity of craft and adaptation to local resources. Each completed garment was not merely fabric, but the culmination of collective skill, cultural knowledge, and practical innovation. Repair and adaptation were essential aspects of clothing culture. Garments were patched, layered, and reshaped to extend their usefulness. Every stitch of mending carried both practicality and care, reflecting the household's ability to manage scarcity while preserving dignity. Creativity in repair sometimes produced decorative elements, turning necessity into subtle artistry. In this underrated era, clothing was an interface between the individual, the community, and the natural world. Protected, expressed, and identified, it embodied skill, patience, and cultural knowledge. Through every garment, simple or elaborate, worn daily or reserved for ceremony, people communicated who they were, where they belonged, and how they related to the environment and society around them. Fashion, utility, and identity were inseparable. Clothing shaped perception, facilitated labor, and reinforced social cohesion. In every stitch, weave, and fold, the era revealed itself. A world where survival and expression, necessity and art, were intricately intertwined, creating a visual and tactile narrative that spoke volumes about human resilience, creativity, and connection. In the underrated era, households were the fundamental units of society, functioning as centers of labor, learning, socialization, and survival. Homes were both shelters and workplaces, where every corner, object, and routine carried significance. Life within these walls reflected the interdependence of family members, the rhythms of seasons, and the broader communal structures that shaped daily existence. Most homes were modest, constructed from locally available materials. Timber frames filled with wattle and daub, stone foundations, and thatched roofs were common, providing protection from the elements and occasional insulation against cold winters. Interior spaces were multipurpose. A single room might serve as kitchen, dining area, living space, and workshop. A central hearth was the heart of the home, providing warmth, light, and the means to cook. Smoke rising from the fire escaped through chimneys or vents, infusing daily life with the scent of cooking, burning wood, and warmth. Rooms were furnished sparingly but functionally. Wooden benches and tables, simple stools, storage chests, and beds made from straw, reeds, or simple cloth offered comfort and utility. Every item had a purpose, often multiple purposes, reflecting resourcefulness and the practical mindset necessary for survival. Rugs or woven mats, while modest, provided warmth and cleanliness, and small decorative touches, such as painted beams or carved wooden elements, offered visual delight. Family structure was hierarchical yet interdependent. The head of the household, often male, held responsibility for security, resource allocation, and labor coordination. The spouse managed domestic affairs, including food preparation, textile work, childcare, and sometimes financial contributions through small trades or craft. Children contributed according to age and skill, performing chores, assisting in production, and learning through observation and direct participation. Extended family members, grandparents, aunts, uncles, or cousins often lived nearby or within the same household, creating a network of shared labor and mutual support. Daily routines followed natural rhythms and communal needs. Mornings were marked by tending animals, fetching water, and preparing meals, while afternoons often involved fieldwork, craft, or trading activities. Evenings were a mix of domestic chores, storytelling, education, and rest. Tasks were not rigidly divided but adapted according to season, necessity, and skill, allowing flexibility while maintaining order. Efficiency was prized, but so was rhythm, the balance between labor and rest, work and reflection. Meals served as both sustenance and social ritual. Families gathered around the hearth, sharing bread, pottage, and small portions of meat or preserved foods. Conversation, instruction, and storytelling accompanied eating, reinforcing bonds and transmitting knowledge. Children learned manners, respect, and communal values through observation and participation, while adults discussed labor, trade, and local events, creating continuity between generations. Childcare and education were integrated into daily life. Younger children were closely supervised while participating in small tasks, learning through imitation and hands-on experience. Older children mentored the younger, fostering responsibility and reinforcing knowledge transfer. Storytelling, songs, and games were educational, teaching memory, morality, and practical skills while also providing entertainment. Learning was immersive and continuous, embedded in the natural flow of daily existence rather than confined to formal lessons. Domestic labor was relentless yet varied. Women managed cooking, cleaning, textile work, and childcare, often simultaneously, while men balanced agricultural duties, craft, and household maintenance. Tasks were cyclical, responding to seasonal demands, animal care, and market opportunities. During harvest or festival periods, the workload intensified, requiring coordinated effort from the entire household. Despite the hard labor, these routines created structure, purpose, and shared achievement, embedding a sense of order and resilience into everyday life. Privacy was minimal by modern standards, yet social cohesion and intimacy were emphasized differently. Sleeping areas were communal, often with multiple family members sharing space for warmth and security. Daily life unfolded openly, with collaboration, supervision, and observation as natural components. Conflict resolution, negotiation, and mutual assistance were learned through engagement rather than isolation, fostering social competence and awareness from an early age. Households also functioned as economic units. Small-scale production, spinning, weaving, brewing, or craftwork contributed to both sustenance and trade. Surpluses were exchanged at local markets, reinforcing interdependence between families and the wider community. Household management required both foresight and adaptability, planning for seasonal scarcity, distributing labor efficiently, and ensuring resources were preserved and utilized wisely. Ritual and domestic life were intertwined. Religious observances, seasonal festivals, and life cycle events, births, weddings, and funerals were managed within the home or coordinated with the community. Each event reinforced social bonds, transmitted cultural knowledge, and integrated spiritual practice with daily existence. Household space was simultaneously practical, symbolic, and nurturing, reflecting the holistic approach to life characteristic of this underrated era. In essence, domestic life was a delicate balance between survival, labor, education, and social cohesion. Homes were hubs of activity, reflection, and growth, where every family member contributed to continuity and stability. The underrated era's households exemplified human ingenuity and adaptability, demonstrating how structure, care, and shared responsibility created resilient communities capable of thriving even under constraints. Every chore, meal, story, and task was part of a larger rhythm, linking individuals to family, family to community, and community to the cycles of nature. Through this intricate domestic web, the era achieved cohesion, survival, and continuity, providing a foundation for the rich, often overlooked, textures of daily life. Trade in this underrated era was more than a transaction. It was the lifeblood of social interaction, cultural exchange, and economic survival. Even in seemingly isolated villages, the movement of goods, skills, and ideas connected communities, creating networks that stretched across regions. Markets were more than places to buy and sell. They were hubs of communication, negotiation, and cultural vibrancy, pulsating with energy and human ingenuity. Villagers often produced a mix of subsistence goods and small surpluses for trade. Farmers brought grains, vegetables, and dairy. Artisans offered tools, textiles, and crafted objects, and specialized tradespeople supplied shoes, metalware, or pottery. Each item had dual purpose: utility and value. The quality of craftsmanship, durability, and aesthetic appeal often determined exchange worth, and reputation as a skilled producer could elevate social standing, drawing buyers from neighboring villages. Market days were events of rhythm and spectacle. Merchants and villagers arrived early, setting up stalls of woven cloth, freshly baked bread, salted meats, or handmade utensils. The aroma of food mingled with the earthy scent of livestock and the occasional waft of smoke from nearby fires. Shouts and laughter punctuated the air, as sellers touted their wares and buyers haggled over prices, negotiating in a language rich with tone, gesture, and subtle persuasion. These spaces were alive, vibrant, and multisensory, offering not only trade but entertainment, news, and socialization. Trade extended beyond food and craft. Herbs, dyes, and medicinal plants were exchanged with precision and care, their value often surpassing everyday goods due to rarity or potency. Spices, imported from distant lands, traveled slowly through complex networks, adding flavor, prestige, and novelty to otherwise modest meals. Even small villages were touched by this web of exchange, carrying traces of distant lands in the form of color, scent, and taste. Barter was the predominant mode, though coinage existed in certain regions. People exchanged labor, goods, or services according to need, ensuring flexibility and adaptability in the face of scarcity. Skill, honesty, and reputation were critical in trade negotiations. A trustworthy artisan or reliable farmer could secure favorable exchanges, while errors, deceit, or poor quality risked social sanction, sometimes eroding a family's standing within the community. Markets also served as venues for information exchange. News of harvests, weather patterns, and neighboring villages' activities circulated quickly, while rumors, gossip, and stories flowed freely, blending practical knowledge with entertainment. Travelers brought news of distant towns, new crafts, or seasonal shifts, expanding awareness and imagination. In this way, marketplaces became cultural crossroads, merging commerce with observation, curiosity, and shared memory. Craftsmen often showcased skill at market, turning work into performance. A blacksmith might demonstrate forging techniques, drawing a crowd of onlookers who marveled at sparks flying from the anvil. A weaver could display intricate patterns and textures, revealing both patience and mastery. Such displays served dual purposes, attracting buyers and reinforcing social identity, demonstrating not only ability but artistry and pride. Festivals and special market days intensified activity. Seasonal fairs combined commerce with celebration, often coinciding with religious observances, solstices, or harvest periods. Music, dancing, and games accompanied transactions, creating an immersive sensory experience. Street performers, jugglers, and minstrels added spectacle, while feasting stalls offered rich flavors and new culinary experiences. Trade became inseparable from cultural life, reinforcing the notion that community vitality depended on both material and social exchange. Trade networks also fostered adaptability and innovation. Villagers learned to value rare materials, experiment with new techniques, and adopt ideas from distant regions. This slow but steady flow of knowledge enhanced local production, improved efficiency, and diversified options available to the community. Even modest villages participated in a larger, interconnected economic and cultural landscape, underscoring the sophistication of what might appear to modernize as a simple rural existence. Seasonality dictated trade rhythms. Certain products, such as grains or dried fruits, were concentrated in harvest periods. Others, like wool or textiles, followed production cycles. This required careful planning, storage, and coordination within households, ensuring that supply met demand and that surplus was neither wasted nor hoarded excessively. Trade demanded foresight, negotiation, and flexibility, cultivating skills that extended beyond economics into social diplomacy and strategic thinking. The marketplaces reflected hierarchy and inclusion simultaneously. Wealthier merchants often occupied central spaces, commanding attention and attracting higher traffic, while smaller producers found niches in peripheral areas, relying on reputation, quality, or unique products. Social mobility was possible, albeit limited, as skill, consistency, and strategic alliances allowed some artisans to expand influence, gain patronage, and secure economic stability for their families. Even in daily, small-scale trade, subtle lessons emerged. Villagers observed fairness, timing, and reciprocity, developing an understanding of trust, value, and consequence. The marketplace became a living classroom teaching negotiation, perception, and strategic thought. Through participation, individuals internalized norms of behavior, ethical conduct, and community expectation, all while engaging in practical survival. Trade in this underrated era was therefore far more than material exchange. It was a dynamic interplay of labor, culture, skill, and social connection. Markets and fairs, barter and negotiation, movement of goods and ideas, all combined to sustain life, strengthen cohesion, and stimulate creativity. These networks connected people, places, and generations, embedding resilience, knowledge, and innovation into the rhythm of daily existence. Through marketplaces, trade, and cultural exchange, communities flourished quietly, crafting a sophisticated world of interdependence and shared identity. Even in simplicity, there was depth, ingenuity, and vibrancy, revealing the understated genius of human adaptation in this often overlooked period. Religion in this underrated era was deeply woven into the fabric of daily existence, influencing behavior, labor, celebrations, and even mundane choices like diet and attire. Faith was not merely a set of abstract beliefs. It was practical, ritualistic, and communal, shaping how people understood the world, their place in it, and their responsibilities toward one another. The spiritual realm interlaced seamlessly with survival, economy, and social life, creating a rhythm that underpinned every village and household. Daily routines were punctuated by small acts of devotion. Morning prayers, blessings over meals, and evening reflection reinforced a constant awareness of higher powers and moral expectations. Houses often contained sacred corners or small altars where families placed icons, candles, or offerings. These objects were tangible anchors, reminding inhabitants of continuity, protection, and shared values. Even the humblest home contained these markers of faith, integrating spirituality into the ordinary flow of life. Communal religious observances were critical. Churches, shrines, or open-air sacred spaces provided venues for gathering, teaching, and ceremony. Villagers attended weekly services or seasonal rituals not only for spiritual nourishment but also for social cohesion, news exchange, and reinforcement of community norms. Music, chanting, and collective recitation enhanced these events, making them immersive experiences that engaged senses, memory, and emotion simultaneously. Through these practices, faith became inseparable from social life. Rituals were often linked to the cycles of nature, labor, and survival. Planting and harvest seasons were marked with prayers, offerings, and festivals designed to secure divine favor. Livestock were blessed to ensure fertility and health, and water sources, fields, and homes received ceremonies to promote abundance and safety. These practices were simultaneously symbolic and practical, offering psychological reassurance, structured communal action, and moral reinforcement of human responsibility toward the environment. Religious festivals were highlights of communal life, blending devotion with joy, spectacle, and sensory richness. Processions, music, dancing, and feasting accompanied ceremonial acts, ensuring that spirituality was experienced collectively and memorably. Children learned moral narratives and social norms through story, song, and ritual, internalizing lessons without formal instruction. Adults reinforced their roles through participation, display of piety, and contribution to communal preparation, creating intergenerational continuity. Clergy and spiritual leaders held authority that extended beyond religious guidance. They mediated disputes, recorded events, instructed youth, and sometimes advised on economic or agricultural matters. Their knowledge of texts, rituals, and moral law positioned them as both educators and influencers, shaping cultural identity while maintaining ethical and spiritual standards. They were conduits of tradition, memory, and normative behavior, ensuring cohesion and continuity within the community. Pilgrimages were another essential aspect of faith. Villagers traveled, sometimes for days or weeks, to visit sacred sites, seek guidance, or fulfill vows. These journeys were physically demanding, socially instructive, and spiritually significant. Pilgrims learned endurance, adaptability, and communal trust as they navigated unfamiliar terrain, encountered strangers, and participated in shared rituals. Pilgrimage, therefore, was not merely an act of devotion. It was an immersive experience linking physical effort, spiritual reflection, and cultural exchange. Religious instruction was embedded in daily activities. Proverbs, hymns, and parables were interwoven with work, play, and household routines. Children learned through repetition, observation, and participation, absorbing ethical guidance alongside practical skills. Moral lessons were contextualized within tangible experience. Helping a neighbor, sharing food, or observing a festival reinforced values more effectively than abstract preaching alone. Symbols and iconography were pervasive. Carvings, painted motifs, and modest sculptures adorned homes, public spaces, and communal structures. These visual cues reinforced narratives, provided ethical exemplars, and connected ordinary life with transcendent ideals. Even objects as mundane as bread molds, candle holders, or textile patterns could carry spiritual meaning, reminding villagers of the moral and cosmic order as they went about daily tasks. Religion also provided structure to moments of crisis and uncertainty. Illness, crop failure, or interpersonal conflict was approached with ritual, prayer, and communal consultation. These practices created psychological resilience, communal solidarity, and moral guidance, embedding faith in the very mechanisms of survival. Life and belief were intertwined. Spiritual observance shaped action, decision-making, and emotional coping, making faith a pragmatic as well as philosophical cornerstone. Through religious life, the underrated era achieved a remarkable synthesis of practicality, morality, and community. Faith was not compartmentalized. It was woven into work, play, diet, craft, and conversation. Belief shaped perception of the world, informed choices, and reinforced social norms. Villagers existed in a space where the sacred and mundane were inseparable, creating a continuous thread of meaning, memory, and purpose. In every prayer, festival, and ritual, communities expressed identity, continuity, and resilience. Spiritual life offered guidance, comfort, and a shared language of symbols and action. It linked individuals to family, neighbors, and ancestors, providing cohesion, moral compass, and emotional sustenance. Even for modern observers, the depth, subtlety, and integration of belief in daily life reveal the extraordinary richness of an era often overlooked, demonstrating how religion shaped both experience and society in enduring ways. In this underrated era, Education was not confined to classrooms or formal institutions, because few existed. It was an immersive, continuous process embedded in daily life, labor, and ritual. Knowledge transmission was practical, social, and multi-generational, ensuring survival, skill mastery, and cultural continuity. From early childhood, individuals absorbed lessons not through textbooks but through observation, imitation, participation, and oral instruction, creating a deeply experiential form of learning that intertwined intellect, emotion, and physical skill. Children were integrated into adult responsibilities almost immediately. Toddlers observed parents spinning, weaving, tending animals, or cooking, gradually learning by doing and mimicking. Early tasks were small: gathering herbs, carrying water, sorting grains. But even these seemingly trivial actions taught coordination, attention to detail, and an understanding of the interconnectedness of work, time, and environment. Learning was experiential and recursive. A mistake became a lesson, success reinforced competence, and observation of others offered ongoing guidance. Apprenticeships were central to skill acquisition. Adolescents worked alongside artisans, blacksmiths, carpenters, or weavers, learning techniques that could take years to master. Mentorship was intense and personal. Knowledge was transmitted not only in explicit instruction but through tacit observation. The rhythm of a loom, the subtle angle of a blade, the timing of fire management. Success required patience, dexterity, and adaptability, as tasks often had multiple acceptable solutions, each refined by experience. Oral tradition was equally vital. Stories, proverbs, songs, and rhymes were primary vehicles of memory and moral instruction. They transmitted history, ethical codes, survival strategies, and technical knowledge in formats that were both engaging and memorable. A tale of a flood might include instructions on constructing durable dwellings. A heroic saga might teach negotiation, courage, or diplomacy. Narratives, layered with mnemonic devices, ensured that essential knowledge survived generations without written records. Learning was social as well as practical. Group work, harvesting, weaving, constructing, or cooking allowed novices to observe interactions, understand division of labor, and internalize norms of cooperation. Informal competitions, games, and challenges tested skill, judgment, and creativity, blending education with entertainment. Through such interaction, social intelligence developed alongside technical skill, reinforcing empathy, observation, and adaptability. Religious instruction also shaped education. Clergy or local elders taught moral precepts, history, and spiritual practice through storytelling, ritual participation, and symbolic acts. These lessons were deeply integrated into daily routines, ensuring that ethical understanding, civic awareness, and cultural memory were inseparable from work, play, and family life. Lessons were repeated cyclically, through festivals, seasonal rituals, and rites of passage, allowing knowledge to embed deeply across time and experience. Seasonality influenced the rhythm of learning. Winter, with its long nights and reduced agricultural labor, became a period of intensified instruction. Families and communities focused on craft, literacy where available, storytelling, and strategy games. Long evenings by the hearth were opportunities for observation, discussion, and reflection, giving space for creativity, critical thinking, and imagination to flourish. Summer and planting seasons emphasized practical skills, physical endurance, and environmental awareness, creating a cyclical pattern of theory and practice, reflection and action. Food, clothing, and domestic tasks were also educational. Preparing meals taught measurement, timing, and resource management. Spinning and weaving conveyed geometry, precision, and patience. Tending animals instilled observation, empathy, and problem-solving. Education in this era was holistic. Body, mind, and spirit were engaged simultaneously, producing well-rounded individuals capable of survival, adaptation, and cultural participation. Even leisure and play contributed to learning. Games, storytelling, riddles, and improvisational activities developed memory, strategy, creativity, and social negotiation. Children learned rules, tested consequences, and explored abstract thinking within a safe, communal environment. These activities blurred the line between amusement and instruction, reinforcing the idea that learning could be immersive, interactive, and inherently enjoyable. Writing and literacy, though limited, supplemented oral and practical instruction. Where texts existed, they were copied meticulously by scribes or household members, preserving legal codes, religious material, recipes, or technical instructions. Access was restricted, but the knowledge contained within these documents complemented the experiential education that permeated everyday life, bridging generations and distant communities. Ultimately, education in this underrated era was not about grades, exams, or formal accolades. It was about cultivating competence, understanding, and adaptability. The learning process ensured survival, creativity, and social cohesion, producing individuals equipped to navigate a complex world while transmitting cultural memory across generations. Through immersive, continuous education, communities preserved both practical survival skills and cultural identity. Children grew into skilled, observant, and resourceful adults. Artisans mastered their crafts. Elders transmitted wisdom, and communities thrived. Even without formal institutions, the era cultivated intelligence, resilience, and continuity, revealing the understated brilliance of a society often overlooked by history. As we reach the conclusion of this long journey through a world often overlooked, it becomes clear that the underrated era was far richer, more intricate, and more inventive than its reputation suggests. Every aspect of life, from the simplest household routine to the complexities of trade, faith, craft, and education, reveals a society defined by resilience, creativity, and subtle sophistication. This era's brilliance was not flashy or ostentatious. It was quiet, persistent, and deeply human. Looking back, one sees that survival demanded intelligence, observation, and cooperation. Communities were interdependent, relying on skill, trust, and shared labor to thrive. Knowledge was accumulated carefully, passed down through practical engagement, apprenticeship, oral tradition, and communal ritual. The seemingly mundane, spinning thread, tending animals, preparing meals, negotiating at markets, was, in fact, an intricate tapestry of learning, adaptation, and social cohesion, each action contributing to a larger web of survival and culture. The creativity of this era extended into aesthetics, craft, and ritual. From the careful patterns woven into cloth, the subtle flavors of preserved foods, and the visual symbolism in clothing and domestic space, to the orchestrated rhythm of festivals, religious ceremonies, and communal labor, every element reflected intentionality and cultural identity. Even in scarcity, human ingenuity transformed necessity into subtle artistry. A repaired garment, a creatively flavored pottage, or a carefully choreographed ritual could carry beauty, meaning, and pride. Spiritual and ethical life was seamlessly interwoven with survival. Belief systems guided labor, inspired moral reflection, and provided comfort during uncertainty. Faith informed decisions, motivated cooperation, and anchored communities to shared values. Festivals, prayers, and pilgrimages served not only devotional purposes but also educational, social, and psychological functions, reinforcing cohesion and continuity across generations. Through ritual, imagination, and storytelling, people cultivated resilience, memory, and identity. Trade and marketplaces, often dismissed as mundane, were in fact engines of connectivity, learning, and innovation. They linked villages, regions, and distant lands through goods, ideas, and cultural exchange. Negotiation, haggling, and barter refined skills of communication, perception, and strategy. Markets were living classrooms, venues of performance, and stages of social interaction, demonstrating that even commerce could be dynamic, engaging, and culturally enriching. Education, though informal, was immersive and continuous. Children and adults alike absorbed knowledge through observation, participation, and storytelling. Skill, craft, memory, and judgment were honed simultaneously, ensuring that every individual developed practical competence, social awareness, and ethical understanding. Play, work, and ritual were interwoven, making learning an intrinsic, natural aspect of daily life. The era produced individuals capable of ingenuity, resilience, and cultural transmission, even without formalized institutions. As one considers leisure, music, storytelling, and play, it becomes evident that life was not merely survival. It was engagement, curiosity, and expression. Art, humor, and narrative were woven into labor and daily interaction, balancing practicality with joy. Community bonds were reinforced through shared experience, collective memory, and the simple delight of witnessing skill, humor, or creativity expressed in everyday life. Perhaps the most striking feature of this era is its subtlety. Its achievements are not preserved in monumental architecture or extensive written records, but in the lived experience of ordinary people. The rhythm of households, the ingenuity of craft, the persistence of knowledge, the beauty of ritual, and the quiet resilience of communities. These achievements remind us that human creativity, adaptability, and ingenuity have always flourished in ways that may be easy to overlook but are profound in impact. By reflecting on the intricacies of diet, clothing, domestic life, trade, religion, education, and social interaction, we recognize the understated genius of this period. Life was complex, interdependent, and rich with innovation and meaning, revealing a civilization that balanced survival with culture, work with joy, and necessity with artistry. It was a world in which every task, every object, and every interaction carried layers of purpose and subtle brilliance. In the end, the underrated era teaches a timeless lesson: that greatness is not always loud, visible, or celebrated in chronicles and monuments. It can be woven quietly into the fabric of daily life, expressed through human ingenuity, care, and perseverance. It exists in communities that sustain themselves, in knowledge transmitted across generations, and in the beauty found in ordinary acts of living. Though history often overlooks it, this era's legacy endures in the structures of human experience. Resilience, creativity, connection, and the extraordinary capacity of people to live, learn, and thrive in ways both subtle and profound. And so, as the story comes to a close, one is left with an appreciation for the layers, textures, and rhythms of an era that quietly shaped the human journey, reminding us that even in simplicity, life can be profound, sophisticated, and endlessly fascinating.